guys, and welcome back to the home stretch of our wading through CHIMES, the 6 reasons people slip. We've now reached surface, which is the S in CHIMES, the last letter. And today I'm going to give you an overview of what that means in terms of, how important is the surface, why, what are the sorts of things you need to look for, and how you can measure and therefore manage floor safety in terms of the surface. And then tomorrow I'll bring this journey through CHIMES to an end with an example of a real life scenario where surface has been important. So let's dive into the slides and get into surface. Just as you can't have a slip without a heel being present, as we talked about earlier in the series, you clearly can't have a slip on a floor without a floor being there. So the floor surface is always relevant as to why somebody might suffer from a slip. Indeed, some research from the US in the hospitality sector suggested that a full 50% of the causation of slip and fall accidents was down to the floor surface. So while surface is the final of the 6 chimes, in many ways it's arguably the most important. Now, what you'll have seen and noticed as we've gone through this journey of talking about chimes is that there is a huge amount of interrelation between the different 6 factors. So when we think about surface, clearly we need to consider contamination and maintenance. So it's always worth bearing in mind that yes, we can focus on an individual, one of the 6 factors, but all of these will be at play. Nonetheless, correlating with what that study from the US said, if you look at this, and you could almost split it in half, S for surface, C for contamination, M for maintenance, all around the floor surface, and that's a full 50% of the CHIMES model. So why is it important to get surface right? Well, if you think about it from a logical perspective, if you start with a good surface, you give yourself half a chance. You can have a good performing slip resistant surface. You could do not such a good job on the other chimes, but effectively you'd still have a floor that could well be safe when wet. If you think about that conversely though, if you start life with a floor surface that isn't particularly effective, but nonetheless you do a good job on the other chimes, well actually you've still got a floor that is going to be slippery when wet, and therefore it's going to contain a risk of having a slip. Now, like with many things in life, what gets measured gets managed, and it's impossible to know by looking at a floor. It's impossible to know by relying on out-of-date data from when the floor was installed. It's impossible to know through guesswork alone or through relying on what someone tells you whether a floor surface is safe when wet or not. The only way to know for sure is to do a slip test. Now, here in the UK, we use this machine called a Pendulum slip test. This is what the HSE used. It's what's used in civil court cases as well. And this is the gold standard of testing. I'm going to run through in more detail how the slip test works, the pendulum test, in another video next week. But in very simple terms, the output of the test is a number. You get a traffic light system of slip potential categories, high, moderate and low. 36 plus on the pendulum, a score of 36 plus gives you a low slip potential. It goes a step further as well. We can correlate the PTV, the pendulum test value, to a risk factor. So if you're over on the right-hand side on this scale and you've got a pendulum test value, dry and wet, of 36 plus, you've got a 1 in a million risk factor. Whereas if you're down on the left-hand side here with a pendulum test value of 24, let's say, you've got a 1 in 20 risk factor. Now, that doesn't mean that 1 in 20 people will slip, but it means that you as a building owner or operator are relying on 1 in 20 people to do something not to slip, if that makes sense. So you're relying on them needing to do something in order to avoid an accident. Whereas if you're up on the 1 in a million side of the spectrum, then you're only relying on 1 in a million people, visitors to your building, having to do something themselves, which is out of your control, to avoid an accident. Now, if you are anything like me, you'd much rather be up in the green zone than in the red. And basically what my team and I do is two things. Firstly, we help people to understand where they are now, and then we help them to figure out what they can do to move from the left to the right and make their surface safer to stop slip and fall accidents from happening. There are two key reasons to do this. Firstly, to defend claims. So I interviewed David Scott of 𝐀𝐁𝐎𝐔𝐓 on my Safety and Risk Success podcast, and this was a quote from him: "If you've got compliant slip test data, you should expect to defend that claim." In other words, it's not possible to 100% eradicate an accident, an incident, an injury from happening. That's not possible, and that's not the expectation. That's not what you're expected to do under the law. But what you are expected to do is to take reasonable and practicable steps to reduce the risk. And how can you evidence that? Well, as we know, it's impossible to evidence it unless you get a slip test. And so what David said was that he recommends that his clients get slip testing done at least annually on these higher risk areas, and that they ensure that the slip test results are good by putting in the right surface, doing the right maintenance, controlling contamination and all these other things, so that they have a certificate that proves that, on that annual basis, that proves that they have taken the reasonable and practicable steps to make their surfaces safe. And if his clients have that, his strong belief and what he's seen over the years dealing with these claims is that claims can be defended. So even if an accident happens, even if someone does slip, even if they do legitimately hurt themselves, you can defend that claim by being able to prove that you had a safe floor surface. The second reason, clearly, why you want to have a surface being safe is that you can prevent accidents from happening in the first place, and therefore stop any claims from arising anyway, because if there's no accident, there's no injury, there's no claim. This is one example where we were working with a leisure group, and before we started this work with them, they were suffering from, on average, around 1 claim per week, so around 50 per year if we use a round number. And these were slips and falls leading to claims in their poolside changing rooms and showers. Now, we went through the CHIMES model with them. We put in place lots of different strategies to help them to reduce the risk. And what we saw was the result that the number of claims they were suffering fell from around 1 per week to around 1 per month. So that's about an 80% fall in the volume of claims by getting CHIMES right. So there's a run through of some of the key ideas around surface for you. And tomorrow I'll be back to go into a live example, which actually is another swimming pool example, because that's a good one that's kind of pretty visceral and people understand that poolside floors are going to get wet and contaminated. So it's always a good one to use. As always, hope that's been useful. If you can start to now see the value of a slip test, which hopefully you can, do remember that I'm giving away £50,000 worth of those this month. If you like and comment on this video, if you take the slip safety scorecard, if you use the hashtag #Sliptember and a few other ways, there are the possibilities of winning a free slip test this month. So do encourage you to do that. And I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow for a example of surface. Cheers.